The Education of OverSoul7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 8. Proteus in the Dig of the Teller's and Story's Tale. Window stood watching the sky as the dusk settled down, filling the wide earthen cup that held the ruins. His head was thrust upward, his long humped nose pointing at the suspiciously empty air above. The search party had not returned as they said they would. For hours he'd waited for their copter's shocking emergence in the usually silent sky. Floaters were leery of Earth night. It was odd that he hadn't heard from them earlier. Window thought back. They had no reason to doubt his word when he told them he hadn't seen the boy, and promised to contact them if he did. He opened his inner senses as fully as possible, but he could perceive no strangers in the immediate area, on the earth's surface, beneath it, or above. No alien thoughts nibbled at the far reaches of his mind. No unfamiliar shapes rose out of the darkness of his inner concentration. He smiled to himself. Either window wasn't open, or the area was safe for the night. Still, he didn't like it. He sat down, fingering a piece of broken pottery. A picture of the woman who made it so many centuries ago flashed into his mind. It was of early 20th century origin, fashioned apparently for show rather than use. Irritably, Window dismissed the images, not wanting to be distracted. No sky elevator had descended or risen that day, so his scouts told him. Then where was the search party? All they needed was a lost search party, he thought wearily. That would bring more floaters down to investigate. Such a situation could be more of a calamity than any they'd ever faced. He looked up. The sky was darkening. Window became aware of a familiar inner sense of motion, activity approaching, still some distance away. He closed his eyes. The inner darkness vibrated, trembled, broke, and a miniature image in full color formed. The searcher's copter. Mentally, Window enlarged the picture. Then his consciousness entered it. There were the same 3 women he'd spoken to yesterday. He picked up their thoughts and conversation at once. So he really couldn't differentiate between what was said or mentally decided upon. He grinned. They weren't going to return. That much was clear. With typical floater's arrogance, they didn't think that he and his men could possibly find the boy if they hadn't. He laughed suddenly, discovering deeper reasons beneath their consciousness. They'd stayed on Earth later than they'd planned in a last attempt to find Proteus, and they felt uneasy about landing at the dig at night with men around who weren't under their thumb. Besides, they were convinced that the sky elevator simply malfunctioned the day Proteus disappeared, releasing itself and leaving evidence of the unauthorized trip on its log. A coincidence that led them to a futile Earth search. Again their prejudice came into play. They should have known that a boy wouldn't be daring enough to attempt such a journey. Now they were convinced that he was hiding someplace in the floating city, where they should have concentrated their efforts all along. It was odd, Window thought, but their prejudice against men did annoy him, even though he understood its roots. But prejudice itself, the sense-feel of it, had a bitter shape to the inner senses. It felt like a prickly bush, whose needles jabbed against his own soft acquiescence to all forms of life. Enough. There was no need to wait the actual appearance of the copter in the sky. It would not stop. They'd already notified the floating city hours ago, and a sky elevator would be picking up the search party, copter and all. He kicked at some debris, went inside one of the small shacks ostensibly used for the dig, pressed a portion of the woodwork, and crossed to the center of the floor. At once a trapdoor opened. He went down the few stairs to the elevator, which dropped him quickly and directly to the inner dig, where Proteus would be waiting. Proteus heard him coming and leapt to his feet. He was full of questions. "Well," Window said, "your search party is leaving. They've decided that you're not on Earth because a boy couldn't be bold enough to pull off such a stunt alone. And being men, we couldn't find you if they didn't." Window smiled dryly. "They're wrong on several points. We have men and women here, and the ruins above the dig is just camouflage. We live beneath, as you know, obviously." "How many of you are there?" Proteus asked. "How do you get away with it?" He was refreshed after a good night's sleep. All he could think of now was the fact that people were actually living beneath the earth, unknown to the people above it. "I can't tell you everything at once," Window said, smiling. "We're supposed to be part of a minor archaeological society, with our own funds. We report to our own mother group in the floating city. Archaeology is considered a harmless male activity, no longer taken seriously since the main population left Earth. So no one bothers us." "I guess I don't understand," Proteus said. "Do men rule things here?" Window shook his head. "Each sex has tried to rule the other throughout history. In a way, the results were more disastrous when men had the upper hand. They became so alienated from themselves as simple individuals that they could only relate through sex-directed activities. But the women are doing a poor job, too, as you should know, with your background. They tried to retaliate and turn the tables until they took on many of the unfavorable traits that they thought were male. I'll explain more about it later, but I can honestly say that we relate here as individuals. Each person is respected for his or her uniqueness. Even names have individual meanings and aren't sexually based." "But how many of there are you?" Proteus asked again. "When will you show me around? Why are you called tellers?" "As for our name, it's like this," Window said. "In ages past, archaeologists used the term tell to refer to the artificial mounds that cover the remains of past ruins. Finally, they called themselves tellers." He shrugged and smiled. "As for some of your other questions, I'm afraid the answers will have to wait for a while. Maybe before too long, you'll learn the rest." "Maybe?" Proteus said. "Maybe," Window repeated. "Many of our ways will be directly counter to those you've been brought up with. We have to decide just how much you can assimilate and accept. We may have to keep you on the outer edges, so to speak. I hope not." "But what could be so strange to me?" Proteus asked. He was tired of sitting around. He wanted to explore the place. "I think you're hedging," he said, looking away. "You do, huh?" Window said. "I am, in a way. But there's someone I want you to meet." He pressed a button and a doorway slid open. Proteus was already gearing himself. Something in Window's tone told him that some type of test was involved. If he failed it, what could they do? What would it mean? Before he had time to think any more about it, a girl entered. She was a little older than he, slender, dressed like Window in flowering overalls and overblouse. "This is Story," Window said. And she came forward smiling. Suddenly her eyes darkened. She took a step backward, shivered slightly, and turned to Window as if for support. "What is it?" Window asked. "I don't know yet." Her voice was so soft that Proteus had to strain to listen. She said, "I just feel that he's a bigger threat than we realized, but in an entirely different way than we thought. I don't know why. The story's only just beginning to come." "Could you be wrong?" Window asked. "Of course," she said irritably. "All of my stories have to be deciphered. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. Some are true now, but not later. Or later, but not now." "What are you staring at me like that for? And what are you talking about?" Proteus asked, hurt. "We've just met. What do you mean about stories?" He frowned at Window unhappily, and wouldn't look at the girl's face. "She's called Story because often stories come to her that are true. They've actually happened or will happen." "But that's just superstition," Proteus said. "I don't want to hurt your feelings, but—" "You don't, Window interrupted, smiling. "Well, if he doesn't understand anything at all, then what's the point?" Story cried, exasperated. "Never mind. Tell me your story," Window said. "I'm sure that Proteus will be polite enough to listen anyway." Proteus shrugged airily, half intimidated, half curious. He tried to ignore the goosebumps that thickened up on the insides of his arms. After all, he thought, what could the girl possibly say? Why did he feel that she could ruin everything? "I can only tell the story as it comes to me," she said. "I just trust it, whether or not it seems to make sense right away. So don't be angry if it sounds strange." "I'm not angry," Proteus said, too loud. He blushed. She kept her eyes open, but looked way over to the other side. "Well, first I see an older man and woman. She's giddy and maybe ready to die. Or maybe he is. They're in some kind of vehicle that was used on Earth centuries ago. Something is about to happen, or maybe it just has. She seems to be talking to some man who's dead and his body is nearby. The two of them are connected with Proteus." Proteus stared at her, transfixed yet scandalized. What nonsense, he thought, wondering how Window could take Story so seriously. "Then there's another man," she said, "older than Proteus, but still young. He's imprisoned in a room all alone. And there's a painting of an ancient farmhouse with trees all around." Proteus stared and leaned forward. He dreamed of such a painting or one like it. The trees had fired his imagination and made him even more determined to go to the earth's surface. "What is it, Proteus?" Window asked. "Nothing." Proteus lowered his eyes uneasily. He wasn't lying, he told himself. It was just coincidence. Story's eyes never changed direction. She kept staring over to the right without turning her head until Proteus was tempted to turn himself, to see what she was looking at. "Anyhow, I don't like this particular man too much," she said. "The one locked in the room. He's terribly self-indulgent. And I see a young black woman, too. She's connected with us, with the tellers, in some odd fashion. And—" Story broke off for a moment. Her face was so grave that Proteus didn't interrupt as he wanted to. Despite himself, he felt frightened, or anticipatory. He couldn't tell which. "She had something to do with archaeology, too," Story went on, "or with ruins, or a god or spirit of some kind. I see her standing by pyramids. But the threat to us comes through her." Story looked at Window now, almost appealingly. "That's all I have so far," she said. "Does any of it make sense to you, Proteus?" He shook his head. "To me least of all. I think that it's, well, just a story. If you want to believe that stuff, that's up to you, but it made no sense at all to me. If it did, I'd tell you. If you get anything more, Story, make sure you tell me," Window said, "and Proteus too." "But if Proteus doesn't understand, and I don't know that he ever will—" "Wait now," Window said. "Proteus, listen to me for a moment. When the women took over, they tried to emphasize physical agility, strength, boldness, logic, all the qualities that men insisted were prerogatives of the male in the past. They minimize some other excellent characteristics because they erroneously consider them beneath their new status and a threat to it. They tried to ignore the intuitive understanding with which they were basically gifted, for example. So there are many quite normal human abilities that you're probably prejudiced against because of your background." "But I'm very open-minded," Proteus objected. "What about seeing into the future or into the past, or reading minds? Just before the massive takeover by the women, scientists were realizing that such things were quite possible. The world was at a point of new discovery. But all that represents the superstitions that the women were able to wipe out," Proteus said. "Granted, they've made a lot of errors, and I was anything but happy as a floater, as you call it. But the women are logical. I'm open-minded about, well, real things." "He's going to be quite impossible," Story said, coldly, to Window. She tried not to sound angry, but she felt quite upset and personally insulted. "No one ever doubted my stories before," she said. "What they mean isn't always apparent at once, but everyone always took it for granted that a meaning was there. The stories do stand for something real. My name's Story because my stories began when I was a child. We pick our names when we're 7, with our parents' help, and confirm them at 14. So you're saying that my name doesn't mean anything. You're trying to deny my whole existence." Her outburst so surprised Proteus that he didn't know what to say. Hopefully, he looked at Window, who unaccountably looked the other way, so Proteus was forced to come to his own defense. "That's not what I meant," he said. "I'm not saying that your name is wrong, or you're wrong. Well, the story you told didn't make sense to me, but it was a story of sorts. So you do tell stories, and your name is right. I just don't think that the story really had anything to do with me." In utter confusion, with his face reddening, he said, "That's all I can say." "And not one thing made sense to you?" she asked, persistent. Proteus shook his head. Then he said, "One small thing sounded familiar, but that was just coincidence or something. You mentioned a painting that sounded like one I've dreamed of several times. Not that I remember many of my dreams, because I don't. That one stuck in my mind because it made me want to come to Earth's surface even more than I did already." Proteus hadn't realized that Story had been so tense, with her shoulders all raised up, until he finished speaking and she suddenly smiled. Her shoulders relaxed, and a flush of warmth transformed her face. "But that isn't anything," he said quickly. He turned to Window, but Window wasn't smiling at Story. "Why should such a small thing make you feel better?" Proteus asked, genuinely surprised. "Nothing else made any sense to me at all." Window said, "The dream may have had something to do with your coming here, but I already intended to." Window turned and placed his hands on Story's shoulders. "You should have learned something from this," he said. "You have to trust your own abilities and not doubt them because someone else does. If we do carry out our present plans, you'll have to hold your own sense of integrity in the face of skepticism just like Proteus's." Then, turning to Proteus, Window said, "You'll be good for her. She isn't used to anyone doubting her word. You'll end up teaching each other." To Story he added soberly, "If you get more on the implied threat, let me know." Then gently, "Distortion could account for it. You could unconsciously consider Proteus a threat to begin with, particularly if you doubt your own abilities in any way. I'll see what I can get, too, though, using my own methods." "What do you mean?" Proteus asked, shocked. "You don't do the same thing?" "Window sees," Story said. "Sees what?" "I see," Proteus said to her. "Enough for now," Window said. "Proteus, we've given you and ourselves enough to think of for one day. But if you really think I'm a threat to you in some way, how come you're taking me in?" "Threats are often challenges," Window said simply. Proteus tried to stall for time. He couldn't tell that the interview would be ended in a minute. Had the meeting with Story involved some kind of test? And had he failed it? Should he have pretended to go along with what she said? "Are you going to show me around?" he asked, uneasily. "Now I feel as if you won't, or as if you've put me on probation, and you still didn't tell me how many people are here." Window stood up. "I think we'll show you the dig by stages, Proteus. We'll begin in the morning, and I'll find something meaningful for you to do while you're here, but some of your questions will have to wait." Proteus nodded, but he felt very alone and increasingly dissatisfied. A girl named Story, whose stories were supposed to be true, though they sounded like nonsense. and a man called Window who could see. See what? And they were only going to show him what they wanted him to know. Already he decided that one way or another, 16 years old or not, he was going to discover whatever it was they were hiding. End chapter 8. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.